Tonight, we bring you 6 deeply disturbing, true Alaskan small-town horror stories that will make you question what really happens in America's most isolated and unforgiving frontier communities. These are not fictional tales, but real accounts from the remote villages and settlements scattered across Alaska's vast wilderness, where help is hours away and darkness reigns for months at a time. Each story has been meticulously documented through police reports, witness interviews, and local testimonies from communities that still refuse to speak openly about what they experienced. Alaska's small towns harbor mysteries that most people will never hear about, and perhaps that is for the best. If you appreciate In late September of 2019, Catherine Morrison arrived in the small Alaskan town of Coldwater, a remote community of barely 300 residents located 90 miles from the nearest highway and over 200 miles from Anchorage. She had accepted a teaching position at the town's only school, a single building that housed grades kindergarten through 12. Catherine thought this would be her fresh start, a place where she could escape the chaos of her divorce and the suffocating memories of her failed marriage in Seattle. She believed that a small town would offer her peace, simplicity, and a chance to rebuild her life in a place where nobody knew her past. She had no idea that within 3 months, she would witness something that would make her question everything she thought she knew about human nature and the secrets that isolated communities can hide. The town of Coldwater sat in a valley surrounded by dense spruce forests and jagged mountains that seemed to block out the sun even during the brief daylight hours of autumn. The population consisted mostly of families who had lived there for generations, supplemented by a handful of workers at the nearby fishing processing plant that operated seasonally. There was one general store, one church, a volunteer fire department, and a small clinic staffed by a rotating nurse practitioner who flew in twice a week. The town had no police department. The nearest Alaska state trooper was stationed over an hour away by float plane, weather permitting. Catherine arrived on a chartered bush plane that landed on a gravel airstrip just outside town. The pilot, a weathered man in his 60s named Tom, helped her unload her bags and gave her a long look before he spoke. He told her that Coldwater was a good town full of good people, but it was not a place for outsiders who asked too many questions. Catherine laughed nervously and told him she was just there to teach, nothing more. Tom nodded slowly and said that was probably for the best. Then he climbed back into his plane and left her standing there with her suitcases, watching as the aircraft disappeared into the gray sky. The school principal, a woman named Margaret Chen, who had lived in Coldwater for 15 years, picked Catherine up in an old pickup truck and drove her to a small cabin on the edge of town. Margaret explained that the cabin came with a teaching position and had been empty since the previous teacher left abruptly the year before. Catherine asked why the teacher had left, but Margaret's expression hardened and she said only that some people were not cut out for the isolation. The cabin was modest but clean, with a wood stove for heat, a generator for electricity, and a well for water. Margaret showed Catherine how everything worked, handed her a list of emergency contacts, and reminded her that school started in 2 days. Before she left, Margaret paused at the door and told Catherine that if she noticed anything unusual in town, it was best to mind her own business and focus on her students. Catherine found the comment strange, but attributed it to small-town eccentricity. The first few weeks passed without incident. Catherine threw herself into her work, teaching a combined class of 15 students ranging from 6th to 8th grade. The children were quiet and well-behaved, almost unnaturally so. They rarely spoke unless spoken to, and seemed uncomfortable making eye contact with her. When Catherine asked them questions about their families or their lives outside school, they gave short, careful answers that revealed almost nothing. She noticed that several of the students had bruises on their arms and legs. But when she brought this up with Margaret, the principal told her curtly that life in rural Alaska was hard, and children got bumps and scrapes from outdoor work. Catherine wanted to press the issue, but remembered Margaret's warning about minding her own business. It was in mid-October when Catherine first noticed the meetings. Every Thursday evening, she observed trucks and snowmobiles arriving at the old community center, a weathered building near the center of town. Dozens of adults filed inside, and the meetings lasted for hours. No children ever attended. Catherine asked one of her students, a 12-year-old girl named Emma, what the Thursday meetings were about. Emma's face went pale, and she said quietly that it was just boring town council stuff that kids did not need to worry about. But the fear in Emma's eyes suggested something very different. Curiosity got the better of Catherine one Thursday night in early November. The temperature had dropped below zero, and darkness came early, with only 4 hours of weak daylight. She bundled up in her parka and walked through the snow-covered streets toward the community center. Light glowed from the windows, and she could hear voices inside, though she could not make out the words. Catherine approached quietly and peered through a gap in the curtains covering one of the windows. What she saw made her blood run cold. The entire adult population of Coldwater seemed to be packed into the room, standing in concentric circles around something in the center. Catherine could not see what they were looking at, but their faces were eerily calm, almost blank. At the front of the room stood a man she recognized as Robert Hayes, who owned the general store. Robert was speaking in a low, rhythmic voice, and the crowd was responding in unison with words Catherine could not understand. It sounded like a chant or prayer, but in no language she had ever heard. Then the crowd parted slightly, and Catherine saw what was in the center of the circle. It was a teenage boy, perhaps 16 or 17, sitting in a chair with his head bowed. Catherine recognized him as David, one of her students' older brothers. His wrists were bound to the arms of the chair with thick rope. As Catherine watched in horror, Robert approached David with something in his hand that gleamed in the lamplight. It looked like a knife. Catherine's instinct was to scream, to bang on the window, to do something to stop whatever was about to happen. But a hand suddenly clamped over her mouth from behind, and another hand gripped her arm with brutal strength. A voice whispered in her ear, low and urgent. It was Margaret. The principal hissed that Catherine needed to be silent and come with her right now if she wanted to live through the night. Terror overrode Catherine's impulse to fight, and she allowed Margaret to pull her away from the window and drag her quickly through the dark streets back toward her cabin. Once inside, Margaret locked the door and closed all the curtains before turning to face Catherine. Her expression was a mixture of anger and genuine fear. Margaret told Catherine that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life by going to that window. She explained that Coldwater was not like other towns, that it had traditions that went back generations, long before Alaska was even a state. These traditions were what held the community together through the brutal winters and the isolation that drove other settlements to extinction. Margaret would not explain exactly what the traditions were, but she made it clear that outsiders who discovered them did not leave Coldwater alive. Catherine's mind was reeling. She demanded to know what they were doing to David, whether they were going to hurt him. Margaret's face softened slightly, and she said that David had volunteered, that it was considered an honor in the community. She told Catherine that the boy would be fine, that the ritual was not what it looked like. But Catherine did not believe her. She had seen the fear in David's eyes, the ropes binding him to the chair, the knife in Robert's hand. Margaret sat down heavily in one of the cabin's wooden chairs and rubbed her face with both hands. She told Catherine that she had a choice to make, She could pretend she had never seen anything, continue teaching, and never speak of this again. If she did that, she would be safe. The community would consider her ignorant and harmless. But if she tried to leave town, or if she tried to contact the authorities, she would disappear just like the teacher before her had disappeared. Margaret's voice was flat and matter-of-fact when she said this, and that made it all the more terrifying. Catherine asked what had happened to the previous teacher. Margaret stood up and walked to the door, her hand on the knob. She turned back and said that the woman had been found in the woods 3 miles outside town in the middle of winter, frozen to death. The official report said she had gotten lost during a walk and succumbed to hypothermia. But Margaret knew the truth. The teacher had seen a Thursday meeting and had tried to hike out of town to reach the highway. They had followed her on snowmobiles, taken her clothes, and left her to die in the darkness and the cold. It was meant to look like an accident, and to everyone outside Coldwater, it did. Margaret left without another word, and Catherine stood alone in her cabin, shaking uncontrollably. She wanted to run, to grab her satellite phone and call for help, to do anything except stay in this nightmare town for another second. But she knew Margaret was telling the truth. She was 90 miles from the nearest road through some of the most unforgiving wilderness in North America. Winter was closing in. The temperatures would soon be deadly. Even if she could make it out of town without being caught, she would freeze to death before she reached help. For the next 2 weeks, Catherine lived in a state of constant terror. She continued teaching as if nothing had happened, but she could barely look at her students without wondering what they knew about their town's dark secrets. David returned to school 3 days after the meeting with a bandage on his left forearm. He seemed pale and withdrawn, but otherwise unharmed. Catherine wanted to ask him what had happened, but she could feel eyes on her constantly. Margaret watched her. Robert watched her. Even the children seemed to be reporting her every move. Then, in late November, Catherine witnessed something that finally made her understand the full horror of Coldwater's traditions. She was walking past the community center late one afternoon when she heard screaming from inside. It was a woman's voice, raw and anguished. Without thinking, Catherine ran to the building and pushed open the door. Inside, she found a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A woman named Lisa, whose daughter was in Catherine's class, was kneeling on the floor, surrounded by a dozen other townspeople. In her arms was a bundle wrapped in blankets, and from the bundle came the weak, mewling cry of an infant. But something was wrong with the baby. Catherine could see its small hand reaching out from the blankets, and the fingers were twisted and malformed. Lisa was sobbing, begging them not to take her child, but the people surrounding her were unmoved. Robert Hayes stood over Lisa with the same blank expression Catherine had seen during the Thursday meeting. He told Lisa that the community had rules, that defective children could not be allowed to drain resources that the whole town needed to survive. He said it was for the greater good. Catherine finally understood. Coldwater did not just have strange traditions. It practiced a brutal form of collective survival that involved sacrificing anyone who was deemed weak or defective. The Thursday meetings were where these decisions were made, where the community decided who would be allowed to stay and who would be taken into the woods and left to die. David had been tested and found acceptable. Lisa's baby had not. Catherine turned and ran from the community center. She ran back to her cabin, locked herself inside, and vomited until there was nothing left in her stomach. She knew she could not stay. She knew they would eventually decide she was a threat. But she also knew she could not escape through the wilderness in the dead of winter. She was trapped. It took Catherine 3 more weeks to formulate a plan. She befriended Tom, the bush pilot, during one of his supply runs to cold water. She told him she had a family emergency and needed to leave as soon as possible. She paid him double his usual fee in cash and made him promise not to tell anyone in town. Tom agreed, though his eyes showed he knew something was wrong. On the morning of December 18th, Catherine walked to the airstrip with only a small backpack. She told Margaret she was going for a walk to clear her head. The temperature was 15 below zero and a light snow was falling. Tom was waiting with his plane already running. Catherine climbed in, and they took off before anyone in Coldwater realized she was leaving. As the plane climbed into the gray sky, Catherine looked down at the town below. She could see people emerging from buildings, pointing up at the aircraft. She could see snowmobiles starting up, though there was nothing they could do now. She was free, but Catherine never told anyone what she had seen in Coldwater. She never went to the authorities or the media, because Tom had told her something during the flight that made her realize the truth was even worse than she had thought. He told her there were dozens of towns like Coldwater scattered across the Alaskan wilderness, each with their own brutal traditions of survival. He told her that the state knew about them, but did nothing because these communities were so remote and self-sufficient that they were essentially invisible. He told her that if she spoke out, she would not just be fighting one small town. She would be fighting a network of isolated settlements that protected each other and eliminated threats without hesitation. Catherine lives in Portland now, working at a public school and trying to forget. But she still wakes up in the middle of the night, thinking about Lisa's baby, and David tied to the chair, and the previous teacher frozen in the woods. And she knows that right now, in Coldwater, another Thursday meeting is happening. Another decision is being made. Another person is being judged. And there is nothing anyone can do to stop it. Jason Caldwell arrived in the small Alaskan town of Birch Creek on June 14, 2021, with a plan to spend 3 weeks photographing the summer wilderness for a travel magazine based in Denver. He was 28 years old, an experienced outdoorsman who had hiked through national parks across the western United States. And he had been dreaming of an Alaska trip for years. Birch Creek, with a population of just under 400 people, was supposed to be his base camp for exploring the surrounding mountains and rivers. The town sat 40 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by bush plane or a treacherous dirt track that was impassable for half the year. Jason thought the remoteness would make for better photographs, more authentic content that had not been captured 1,000 times before. He had no way of knowing that he would never leave Birch Creek alive, and that his disappearance would become one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in modern Alaskan history. Jason checked into the Birch Creek Lodge, the only accommodation in town, run by a husband and wife team named Frank and Susan Morrison. The lodge was a rustic 2-story building with 8 rooms, a small restaurant on the first floor, and a bar that served as the social center for locals and the occasional tourist. Frank was a large man in his 50s, with a thick beard and a gruff manner, while Susan was quieter, more watchful. They welcomed Jason cordially enough and gave him a room on the second floor overlooking the main street, which consisted of a general store, a post office, a fuel depot, and a handful of houses. For the first week, everything went exactly as Jason had planned. He spent his days hiking into the wilderness with his camera equipment, photographing the endless forests of black spruce and white birch, the crystal clear streams teeming with salmon, and the mountains that rose up in every direction like ancient sentinels. He returned to the lodge each evening tired but exhilarated, uploading his photos to his laptop and writing notes for his article. He ate dinner in the lodge restaurant and occasionally had a drink at the bar, where he made small talk with the locals who gathered there. They were friendly in a reserved way, answering his questions about hiking trails and wildlife, but never volunteering much information about themselves or the town. On June 20th, Jason mentioned to Frank that he wanted to hike to a place called Raven's Gorge, a narrow canyon about 8 miles north of town that was supposed to have spectacular waterfalls. Frank's expression changed instantly. He told Jason that Raven's Gorge was not a good place to go, that the terrain was dangerous and people had gotten hurt there in the past. Jason pressed for details, but Frank became evasive, saying only that it was easy to lose your way in that area and that cell phones did not work out there. Jason thanked him for the warning, but made it clear he intended to go anyway. He was an experienced hiker. He had a satellite GPS device, and he was not afraid of challenging terrain. Frank stared at him for a long moment and then walked away without another word. The next morning, June 21st, Jason left the lodge at 6 in the morning. He told Susan he would be back by nightfall and asked her to save him a plate of whatever the dinner special was. Susan nodded and watched from the window as Jason walked down the street and disappeared into the forest at the north end of town. That was the last confirmed sighting of Jason Caldwell alive. When Jason failed to return by 10 that night, Susan mentioned it to Frank, but he said the young man had probably underestimated the hike and decided to camp overnight. He would likely show up in the morning tired and embarrassed. But when Jason did not appear by noon the next day, Susan insisted they contact the Alaska State Troopers. The nearest trooper, a man named Sergeant Michael Torres, flew into Birch Creek that afternoon and immediately organized a search party. Sergeant Torres interviewed Susan and Frank, who repeated what they had told him about Jason's destination. Torres then asked for volunteers from the town to help search the area around Raven's Gorge. A dozen men stepped forward, including Frank and a lean, silent man named Christian Novak, who worked as a hunting guide. Torres noted that the volunteers seemed competent and familiar with the wilderness, which was fortunate given the vast area they needed to cover. The search party set out at dawn on June 23rd, spreading out in a grid pattern as they moved north toward Raven's Gorge. The terrain was brutal, with thick underbrush, steep hillsides, and countless streams that had to be crossed. Torres kept the searchers in radio contact as best he could, but the mountains interfered with the signal. By late afternoon, one of the groups radioed that they had found something. It was Christian Novak's team, and they were at the southern entrance to Raven's Gorge. When Torres reached the location, Christian showed him what they had discovered. It was Jason's backpack, sitting upright on a flat rock beside the trail. The backpack was completely intact, not torn or damaged in any way. Inside, Torres found Jason's wallet, his satellite GPS device, his camera with a memory card still in it, 3 energy bars, and a full water bottle. Everything a hiker would need for a day trip. The only thing missing was Jason himself. Torres examined the GPS device and checked the last recorded location. It showed that Jason had reached this exact spot at approximately 9:30 in the morning on June 21st. Then, the device had been turned off. Torres found this deeply strange. Why would an experienced hiker turn off his GPS in unfamiliar wilderness? And why would he leave his backpack with all his supplies sitting neatly on a rock? Christian suggested that maybe Jason had set down his pack to take photographs without the extra weight and had wandered off the trail. Torres agreed this was possible and ordered the search to focus on the area immediately surrounding the backpack location. For the next 3 days, the search party combed through Raven's Gorge and the surrounding forest. They found no trace of Jason, no footprints, no torn clothing, no signs of a struggle or an animal attack. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. On June 27th, Torres expanded the search radius and brought in additional troopers and a search and rescue dog team from Anchorage. The dogs were given Jason's scent from clothing in his lodge room and led to the location where the backpack had been found. But from that point, the dogs could not pick up a trail. They circled the area, whining and agitated, but they could not indicate a direction that Jason had gone. The dog handlers told Torres this was extremely unusual. Even if Jason had climbed onto rocks or crossed water, the dogs should have been able to find some scent trail. It was as if Jason's scent simply ended at the rock where his backpack had been placed. Torres began to suspect that Jason's disappearance was not a simple case of getting lost. He returned to Birch Creek and conducted more detailed interviews with the townspeople. He asked about Raven's Gorge and why Frank had warned Jason not to go there. Most people gave vague answers about difficult terrain, but an elderly woman named Helen, who lived alone on the edge of town, told Torres something that made his blood run cold. Helen said that Raven's Gorge had a bad reputation going back decades. She said that at least 4 other people that she knew of had disappeared in that area over the years, all of them outsiders passing through Birch Creek. The first had been in 1987, a geologist working for an oil company, then a backpacker in 1995, a wildlife biologist in 2004, and a hunting guide from Fairbanks in 2013. None of them had ever been found. Helen told Torres that the old-timers in Birch Creek believed there was something wrong with Raven's Gorge, something that did not want people there. When Torres asked what she meant by something, Helen just shook her head and said she had already said too much. Torres confronted Frank Morrison with this information. He demanded to know why Frank had not mentioned the previous disappearances when Jason went missing. Frank's face hardened. He said that those old stories were just superstition and coincidence. People got lost in the Alaskan wilderness all the time. It did not mean there was anything sinister about Raven's Gorge specifically. But Torres noticed that Frank would not meet his eyes when he said this. On June 30th, one of the search teams found something else. It was Christian Novak who made the discovery, deep in Raven's Gorge, about 2 miles from where Jason's backpack had been found. It was a small clearing in the forest, roughly circular, about 30 feet in diameter. The ground in the clearing was completely bare. No grass, no moss, no vegetation of any kind. Just dark, packed earth. In the center of the clearing was a pile of stones, arranged in a cairn about 3 feet high. And on top of the cairn was Jason's camera. Torres examined the camera carefully. It was undamaged, and the battery still had a charge. He turned it on and reviewed the photographs on the memory card. The last photos Jason had taken showed the forest trail approaching Raven's Gorge, scenic shots of trees and mountains. But then there were 3 photographs that made no sense. They were taken in sequence, time-stamped at 9:45 in the morning on June 21st, 15 minutes after the GPS device had been turned off. The first photograph showed the clearing with the stone cairn. The second photograph showed a group of people standing in a circle around the cairn. Torres counted 12 figures, all wearing dark clothing with their faces obscured by hoods. The third photograph was badly out of focus, as if the camera had been moving or shaking when the shot was taken. It showed a blurred image of hands reaching toward the camera and what might have been a face, pale and distorted. Torres felt his hands trembling as he held the camera. He asked Christian how the camera had gotten on top of the cairn when Jason's backpack had been found 2 miles away. Christian had no answer. Torres then asked if Christian recognized any of the people in the photograph, but Christian said the image was too unclear to identify anyone. Torres did not believe him. The way Christian's jaw tightened when he looked at the photo told Torres that the man knew exactly who those people were. Torres returned to Birch Creek and confronted the entire town at a meeting in the community center. He showed the photographs to everyone and demanded an explanation. He said he believed that someone in Birch Creek knew what had happened to Jason Caldwell and that he intended to investigate this as a possible homicide. The room was silent. People looked at each other, but no one spoke. Finally, Frank Morrison stood up and said that Torres was wasting his time. He said the photograph proved nothing except that Jason had found some old ceremonial site, probably native Alaskan, and taken pictures before he wandered off and got lost. Frank said that if Torres wanted to waste state resources searching for a careless tourist, that was his business. But the people of Birch Creek had lives to live and could not spend any more time on this. Torres knew he was beaten. Without cooperation from the locals, without physical evidence of a crime, and with hundreds of square miles of wilderness to search, there was no way to prove what had happened to Jason. The official search was called off on July 5th, 2021. Jason Caldwell was declared a missing person, and the case remains open, but inactive. But Sergeant Torres did not give up entirely. He spent months investigating Birch Creek from a distance, pulling records and talking to people who had visited the town over the years. He discovered that Helen had been telling the truth about the previous disappearances. 4 people had indeed vanished near Raven's Gorge going back to 1987, all of them outsiders, all of them last seen in Birch Creek. And in each case, the searches had found strange evidence that made no sense. The geologist's boots had been found neatly placed on a tree stump. The backpacker's tent had been found fully set up with all her gear inside, but no sign of the woman herself. The wildlife biologist's notebook had been found with pages torn out. The hunting guide's rifle had been found leaning against a rock, unloaded, with the ammunition scattered in a perfect circle around it. Torres also discovered something else. He found records of land ownership in the Raven's Gorge area and learned that the clearing where Jason's camera had been found was on private property that had been in the same family for over 100 years. The family name was Novak. Christian Novak's family. Torres attempted to get a warrant to search the Novak property, but the district attorney refused. There was no probable cause, no evidence of a crime, just a series of coincidences and a photograph that could be interpreted a dozen different ways. Torres was told to let it go. But Torres could not let it go. He became obsessed with the case, convinced that the people of Birch Creek were protecting a terrible secret. He believed that whatever happened in Raven's Gorge was not random, that it was deliberate, and that Jason Caldwell had stumbled onto something he was never meant to see. Torres believed the photograph showed a ritual, and that the hooded figures had taken Jason for reasons he could only guess at. In December of 2022, Sergeant Michael Torres took early retirement from the Alaska State Troopers. He told colleagues he was burned out and needed a change. But those who knew him well said he was a different man after the Jason Caldwell case, haunted and withdrawn. Torres moved to Arizona and cut off contact with almost everyone he knew in Alaska. To this day, Jason Caldwell's family offers a $50,000 reward for information leading to his whereabouts. They have hired private investigators and psychics and searched on their own. But Birch Creek remains silent. The people there refuse interviews and run off anyone who asks too many questions about Raven's Gorge. And every year, on the anniversary of Jason's disappearance, someone places fresh flowers on the stone cairn in the clearing. Sergeant Torres knows this because he hired a private investigator to set up a trail camera watching the site. The camera shows a hooded figure approaching in the early morning darkness, placing the flowers and leaving without ever showing their face. Jason's mother keeps his camera in a locked drawer in her home in Denver. She has looked at those last 3 photographs 1,000 times, searching for some clue, some detail that might explain what happened to her son. But all she sees are shadows and blurred faces and the image of hands reaching toward the camera in the instant before everything went dark. And in Birch Creek, Christian Novak still guides hunters through the wilderness. And Frank Morrison still runs the lodge. And the people still gather in private and speak in whispers about the things that must be done to keep their town alive in the unforgiving Alaskan wild. And Raven's Gorge waits, silent and patient, for the next outsider who ignores the warnings and ventures too deep into places where they do not belong. Brooke Sullivan moved to the small Alaskan town of Millers Point in March of 2020, just as the pandemic was beginning to shut down the rest of the world. She had lost her job as a restaurant manager in Juneau and could no longer afford her apartment there. A friend of a friend told her about a cheap rental in Millers Point, a tiny fishing community of 200 people on the coast, where the cost of living was low and jobs at the cannery were usually available. Brooke was 32 years old, recently divorced, and desperate for a fresh start somewhere she could afford to live while she figured out her next move. The rental was a small 1-bedroom house at the end of a gravel road, isolated from the main cluster of buildings that made up the town center. The landlord, a man who lived in Anchorage and owned several properties in remote communities, rented it to her for $600 a month, which was all she could manage. Brooke thought the isolation would be peaceful, a chance to heal from her failed marriage and reset her life. She had no idea that the house's isolation would become a prison, and that her neighbor would turn her peaceful retreat into a nightmare that would change her understanding of how evil can hide behind a friendly face. The house was small but adequate, with a wood stove for heat, a propane generator for electricity, and well water that tasted faintly of iron. The furniture was old but functional. The windows were drafty and the floors creaked, but Brooke had lived in worse places. What mattered most was that it was hers, at least for as long as she could pay the rent. The nearest neighbor was about 200 yards away through a thin strip of spruce trees. Brooke could see the neighbor's house from her kitchen window, a larger and better maintained building with a satellite dish on the roof and a newish pickup truck parked outside. On her second day in Millers Point, the neighbor came to introduce himself. His name was Adam Pierce, and he appeared to be in his mid-40s, tall and lean with graying hair and a quiet, careful way of speaking. He welcomed Brooke to the area and told her that if she needed anything, she should not hesitate to ask. He explained that living in remote Alaska required neighbors to look out for each other because help from town could be a long time coming in an emergency. Brooke thanked him and appreciated the gesture. Adam seemed kind and respectful, keeping a polite distance and not overstaying his welcome. Before he left, he mentioned that he worked from home as a software consultant and was around most of the time if she ever needed assistance with anything. For the first few weeks, Adam was the model neighbor. He helped Brooke figure out how to properly maintain her wood stove when she was having trouble keeping the house warm. He showed her where the best spot was to get cell phone reception, a small hill about a quarter-mile away, where you could sometimes get a single bar of service. He even brought her fresh-caught halibut one evening, saying he had caught more than he could eat and thought she might enjoy some. Brooke was grateful for his kindness and felt fortunate to have such a helpful neighbor in such an isolated place. But then small things started to happen that made Brooke uncomfortable. She began noticing that items in her house were not quite where she had left them. A coffee mug moved from one counter to another. A book on her nightstand that she was certain she had left closed was now open to a different page. A chair in her living room turned at a slightly different angle. Each incident was minor enough that Brooke convinced herself she was misremembering or being paranoid. The isolation and silence of the house were getting to her, making her imagine things. Then one morning in early April, Brooke woke up and found muddy boot prints on her kitchen floor, leading from the back door to the hallway outside her bedroom. Her back door was locked from the inside, and she had heard nothing during the night. The boot prints were too large to be hers. Someone had been in her house while she was sleeping. Brooke's hands shook as she examined the prints. They led to her bedroom door, and then back to the kitchen, as if someone had stood outside her room watching her sleep before leaving the way they had come. Brooke immediately walked to Adam's house and knocked on the door. When he answered, she told him about the boot prints and asked if he had seen anyone around her property. Adam's face showed concern, and he said he had not noticed anything unusual, but he would keep an eye out. He suggested that maybe it had been an animal, perhaps a bear, though he admitted bear prints did not really look like boot prints. His explanation made no sense, and Brooke left feeling more unsettled than reassured. She noticed as she walked away that Adam was wearing boots, and she wondered about the size. That night, Brooke wedged a chair against her back door and slept with a kitchen knife under her pillow. She barely slept at all, jerking awake at every small sound. In the morning, the chair was still in place, but when she looked out her kitchen window toward Adam's house, she saw him standing on his porch, looking directly at her window. When he saw her looking back, he raised his hand in a casual wave and went back inside. The gesture felt wrong, almost mocking. Over the next week, the incidents escalated. Brooke began hearing footsteps on her porch at night, soft and deliberate, circling the house. When she looked out the windows, she saw no one. She found scratches on her bedroom window as if someone had been testing whether it would open. Her mail, which was delivered to a box at the end of her driveway, started arriving already opened. And twice she came home from trips to the general store to find her front door unlocked, even though she was certain she had locked it before leaving. Brooke tried to report the incidents to the town's volunteer constable, an older man named Gary, who worked part-time and had no real law enforcement training. Gary listened to her story and said he would look into it, but he clearly did not take her seriously. He suggested she was probably not used to living alone in such a remote area, and that isolation could play tricks on the mind. He told her to install better locks and maybe get a dog for security. Brooke left his office feeling dismissed and alone. She decided to confront Adam directly. One afternoon, she walked to his house and knocked on the door. When he answered, she told him plainly that she believed someone was harassing her and that she suspected it might be him. Adam's expression did not change. He looked at her with calm, unreadable eyes and asked why she would think such a thing. Brooke explained about the boot prints, the disturbed items, the footsteps, the scratches. Adam listened quietly and then told her he was sorry she was having such a difficult time adjusting to life in Miller's Point. But he had nothing to do with any of it. He said that perhaps she should consider moving somewhere less isolated if she was feeling this paranoid and unsafe. The way he said paranoid made it clear he thought she was mentally unstable. That night, Brooke decided to set a trap. She took a photo of her living room with her phone, making sure to capture the exact position of every object. The coffee table, the books, the couch cushions, everything. Then she left the house and walked to the general store, deliberately staying away for 2 hours. When she returned, she immediately took another photo. Someone had been inside, The coffee table had been moved 3 inches to the left. One of the couch cushions had been flipped over. And sitting on her kitchen counter was a piece of paper with a single word written on it in neat handwriting. Watching. Brooke felt her chest tighten with fear and rage. She grabbed the note and marched to Adam's house, pounding on the door. When he opened it, she shoved the paper in his face and demanded to know why he was doing this to her. Adam took the note, examined it, and then looked at her with what appeared to be genuine confusion. He said he did not know what she was talking about and asked if she had considered that maybe someone else in town had access to her house. He suggested that maybe her landlord had given a key to a previous tenant who had not returned it. The suggestion was plausible enough that Brooke hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Adam smiled. It was a small smile, barely noticeable, but it told Brooke everything she needed to know. He was enjoying this. Brooke contacted her landlord that same day, using the spotty cell phone reception from the hill. She told him about the harassment and demanded to know who else had keys to the house. The landlord insisted that only he and Brooke had keys, but he offered to change the locks if it would make her feel better. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the previous tenant had left very suddenly in the middle of the night and had never collected her security deposit. When Brooke asked why the woman had left, the landlord said he did not know, that she had just called him and told him she was never coming back to Miller's Point and to keep the deposit. This information sent a chill through Brooke. She asked the landlord what the previous tenant's name was, and he told her it was a woman named Rachel Dunn. Brooke asked if he had contact information for Rachel, but the landlord said the number he had for her was disconnected. Brooke thanked him and ended the call, her mind racing. She needed to find Rachel Dunn and learn what had happened to her. It took Brooke 3 days of searching online and making calls to finally track down Rachel Dunn. She found her living in Seattle, working at a bookstore. When Brooke called and explained who she was and where she was living, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Rachel asked in a shaking voice if Brooke's neighbor was a man named Adam Pierce. When Brooke confirmed this, Rachel began to cry. Rachel told Brooke everything. She said Adam had done the same things to her, the harassment, the stalking, the gaslighting. It had started small and escalated over months until Rachel was afraid to sleep in her own house. She had tried to report it to the local constable, but Adam was well liked in Miller's Point and had lived there for years, so no one believed her. Rachel said that Adam had somehow gotten a key to the rental house and would come inside whenever she was gone or sleeping. He would move things, leave notes, watch her through the windows. It became unbearable. The final straw came when Rachel woke up one night to find Adam standing in her bedroom doorway, just watching her in the darkness. She had screamed, and he had left without saying a word. Rachel packed a bag and left Miller's Point that same night, hiking to the main road and hitching a ride to Juneau. She never went back. Rachel told Brooke that she later learned Adam had done this to at least 2 other women who had lived in that house before her. The landlord kept renting it to single women because the rent was cheap and they were usually desperate for housing, and Adam kept terrorizing them until they left. Rachel believed Adam got sexual gratification from the fear and power that he was a predator who had found the perfect hunting ground in an isolated town where no one would stop him. Brooke felt sick. She asked Rachel why she had not gone to the police in Juneau or reported Adam to state authorities. Rachel said she had tried, but without proof, and given the remote location, the police had told her it would be difficult to investigate and prosecute. They suggested she just stay away from Miller's Point, which she had done. Rachel warned Brooke to leave immediately, to not waste time trying to fight or expose Adam. She said he was dangerous and the town would protect him, not her. Brooke made her decision that night. She packed her essential belongings and left everything else. She hiked to the main road in the darkness and waited until dawn when a supply truck came through heading to Juneau. The driver gave her a ride, asking no questions about why a woman was standing alone on a remote highway at sunrise. Brooke never went back to Miller's Point. She lost her security deposit and the belongings she left behind, but she considered it a small price to pay for her safety. She found work in Juneau and tried to rebuild her life for the second time in a year. But Brooke still thinks about Adam Pierce every day. She thinks about the way he smiled when she confronted him, the way he stood on his porch watching her window, the way he had stood in Rachel's bedroom doorway in the darkness. She thinks about how many women he has terrorized over the years and how many more he will terrorize in the future. She thinks about the house at the end of the gravel road and wonders who is living there now and whether Adam is already watching them, already planning his next game of psychological torture. And she knows that Adam is still there in Miller's Point, waiting for the next desperate woman who needs cheap housing in a remote town where neighbors are supposed to look out for each other, where a kind man offers help and fresh-caught halibut and slowly reveals himself to be something much darker, where screams do not carry far enough for anyone to hear, and where isolation is not peace, but a trap. The winter of 2018 to 2019 was one of the coldest and darkest in recent memory for the small Alaskan town of McCarthy, population 250. The sun disappeared for nearly 2 months. The temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, and the snow piled so high that some houses were buried up to their windows. It was the kind of winter that tested the resolve of even the hardiest residents, the kind that made people wonder why anyone would choose to live in such an unforgiving place. But what made that winter truly unforgettable was not the cold or the darkness. It was the fact that 3 people vanished without a trace over the course of 12 weeks, disappearing one by one in a pattern so disturbing that it still haunts those who remain. The first to disappear was Sean Mitchell, a 41-year-old mechanic who had lived in McCarthy for 15 years. Sean was well-liked and reliable, the kind of man who would drop everything to help a neighbor fix a broken snowmobile or repair a generator. He lived alone in a small cabin on the south edge of town and kept to himself outside of work, but everyone knew him and trusted him. On the evening of December 7th, 2018, Sean left the town's only bar around 9 in the evening, telling the bartender he was heading home to get some sleep. The walk from the bar to his cabin was less than half a mile, a route Sean had walked hundreds of times. He never arrived home. When Sean did not show up for work the next morning, his boss went to check on him. The cabin was locked and dark, with no sign of Sean. His snowmobile was still parked outside, covered in fresh snow, meaning it had not been used recently. Inside the cabin, everything appeared normal. Sean's bed was made, his dishes were washed, and his winter coat was hanging by the door. The only strange detail was that Sean's boots were missing. He had apparently left the bar wearing them, but they were not in the cabin, and no footprints led away from the building through the snow. It was as if Sean had simply vanished between the bar and his home. A search was organized immediately, with volunteers combing the route between the bar and the cabin, checking every building and shed along the way. They found nothing. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn clothing. Sean Mitchell had disappeared as completely as if he had never existed. The Alaska State Troopers investigated and theorized that Sean might have become disoriented in the darkness and cold, perhaps due to alcohol, and wandered off the path into the surrounding forest where he froze to death. But this theory did not explain the lack of tracks or why an experienced Alaskan would become so disoriented on a familiar route in his own town. 6 weeks later, on January 20th, 2019, the second disappearance occurred. Caroline Hayes was a 34-year-old nurse who flew into McCarthy once a week to provide medical services to the community. She stayed in a small apartment above the general store during her visits. On the evening of January 20th, Caroline finished her clinic hours and told the store owner she was going upstairs to rest before her flight out the next morning. The store owner locked up at 8 in the evening and went home, leaving Caroline alone in the apartment. The next morning, when the bush pilot arrived to pick up Caroline, she was gone. The apartment was undisturbed. Caroline's suitcase was packed and sitting by the door, ready for her departure. Her coat and boots were missing, suggesting she had dressed to go outside. But the door to the apartment had been locked from the inside, and the only way out was down an exterior staircase that led to the street. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, and there were no footprints on the stairs or in the street below. Caroline Hayes had vanished from a locked apartment without leaving a trace. This second disappearance sent a wave of fear through McCarthy. People began to speculate that something was hunting them, that the darkness and cold had brought something evil to their town. The state troopers returned and conducted a more intensive investigation, interviewing every resident and searching every building. They found no evidence of foul play, no signs of Caroline, nothing that explained how a woman could disappear from a locked room without using the only exit. The official theory was that Caroline had somehow left the apartment before the snow fell, perhaps to meet someone or take a walk, and had gotten lost or fallen into a hidden crevasse. But the locked door and the lack of footprints made this explanation feel hollow. The third disappearance happened on March 3rd, 2019, just as the sun was beginning to return for more than a few hours each day. Zoe Brennan was a 26-year-old woman who worked at the town's fuel depot, one of the few year-round jobs available in McCarthy. Zoe was quiet and kept to herself, living in a trailer at the north end of town. On the afternoon of March 3rd, Zoe finished her shift at the fuel depot at 4 in the evening. A co-worker saw her walking toward her trailer in the fading daylight. That was the last confirmed sighting of Zoe Brennan. When Zoe did not show up for work the next morning, her supervisor went to check on her. The trailer was unlocked and empty. Inside, investigators found a scene that was both mundane and deeply unsettling. Zoe's work clothes were folded neatly on her bed. Her dinner, a half-eaten bowl of soup, was on the kitchen table, still lukewarm. The television was on, playing static because the broadcast had ended, and on the bathroom mirror, someone had written a single word in what appeared to be condensation or steam. 3. The word 3 sent a chill through everyone who saw it. It seemed to suggest that the disappearances were not random, that they were deliberate, and that whoever or whatever was responsible was counting. But counting what? Victims? Warnings? No one knew, and the ambiguity made it even more terrifying. The Alaska State Troopers brought in additional resources, including criminal profilers and search and rescue teams. They interviewed every single person in McCarthy, looking for connections between Sean, Caroline, and Zoe. What they found was disturbing in its implications. All three had disappeared on dates that fell exactly 6 weeks apart. All three had vanished without any physical evidence of their departure. And all three had been alone at the time of their disappearance, with no witnesses to what had happened. More disturbing still was a detail that emerged during the investigation. A local woman named Linda, who had lived in McCarthy for 30 years, came forward with information she had been afraid to share. She told the troopers that similar disappearances had occurred in the winter of 1989 to 1990, 30 years earlier. 3 people had vanished that winter, one every 6 weeks, all without a trace. Linda had been young at the time and remembered the fear that had gripped the town. The disappearances had stopped after the 3rd victim, and life had eventually returned to normal. People tried to forget, but Linda had never forgotten. And when the pattern repeated itself in 2019, she knew it was not a coincidence. The troopers searched through old records and confirmed Linda's story. In the winter of 1989 to 1990, 3 McCarthy residents had indeed disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The cases had never been solved. The files were still open but had long since gone cold. The similarities to the 2019 disappearances were undeniable. The 6-week intervals, the lack of physical evidence, the sense that something was deliberately taking people. But why every 30 years? And why always 3 people? And why did it stop after the 3rd victim? These questions haunted the investigation, and no answers were found. The troopers explored every possible explanation: serial killer, cult activity, human trafficking, even animal attacks. Though no animal could explain the locked doors and missing footprints, nothing fit. The evidence, or rather, the lack of evidence, defied logical explanation. As winter turned to spring in 2019, the people of McCarthy waited in terror for a 4th disappearance. But it never came. 6 weeks passed, then 12, then 20. No one else vanished. It was as if whatever had taken Sean, Caroline, and Zoe was satisfied and had moved on. Or perhaps it was simply waiting, counting down the years until 2049, when it would return and claim 3 more victims. To this day, none of the 3 have been found. No bodies, no clothing, no evidence of what happened to them. The official files list them as missing persons, likely deceased due to exposure or misadventure. But those who lived through that winter in McCarthy know the truth is darker and stranger than any official report can capture. And there is one more detail that has never been made public, something that only a handful of people know. In the weeks following Zoe's disappearance, 2 other residents of McCarthy found messages in their homes. One found the word 3 written in frost on the inside of their bedroom window. Another found it scratched into the wooden door of their shed. Both people left McCarthy within days and have never returned. The town still exists, smaller now than it was in 2019. Some families left after that winter, unable to live with the fear and the unanswered questions. Those who remain do not talk about what happened, especially not to outsiders. They go about their lives, work their jobs, endure the long winters. But every December, when the darkness returns and the temperature plummets, they count the weeks and hold their breath and pray that the pattern will not repeat. Not this year. Not yet. And they wonder who will be chosen when it does. Kyle Pearson had worked the night shift at the Harbor Point Fuel Depot for 3 years. And in that time, he had seen just about everything the remote Alaskan fishing community had to offer. He had pumped gas for drunk fishermen at 2 in the morning, helped stranded travelers who had run out of fuel on the isolated coastal road, and dealt with his share of belligerent customers who did not appreciate that the depot was the only source of fuel for 60 miles in any direction. Kyle was 29 years old, saving money to buy his own fishing boat, and the night shift paid a premium that made the loneliness and boredom worth it. Harbor Point had a population of 320, most of whom worked at the fishing processing plant or on the boats that came and went with the seasons. The fuel depot sat on the edge of town, where the main road ended and the wilderness began. a small building with 2 pumps and a convenience section that sold basic supplies. Kyle worked alone from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning, 5 nights a week. It was monotonous work, but Kyle did not mind. He liked the quiet and the solitude. At least, he did until the night of October 15th, 2022, when a customer arrived who would change everything. It was just past midnight when the headlights appeared on the road. Kyle was sitting behind the counter reading a paperback Western novel and drinking bad coffee from the machine that he had never managed to fix properly. He looked up as a white van pulled up to the pumps. The van was older, maybe 15 years, with no markings or windows in the back. Kyle could not see the license plate clearly through the rain that had been falling steadily all evening. A man got out of the driver's side and walked toward the building. He was in his 40s, average height and build, wearing a dark rain jacket and jeans. Nothing about him stood out as unusual. The man entered the depot and nodded to Kyle without speaking. He walked to the beverage cooler and grabbed 2 energy drinks, then picked up a bag of beef jerky from the rack. He brought the items to the counter and asked Kyle to turn on pump 2. His voice was flat and emotionless, the kind of tone that suggested he did not want conversation. Kyle rang up the items and told the man the total. The man paid in cash, exact change, and walked back outside to pump his gas. Kyle watched through the window as the man filled the van's tank. Something about the situation felt off, though Kyle could not pinpoint exactly what. Maybe it was the late hour, or the man's unfriendly demeanor, or the way the van sat low on its suspension as if it was carrying something heavy. Kyle had developed good instincts during his years working nights in remote locations, and those instincts were telling him to pay attention. When the man finished pumping, he hung up the nozzle and walked toward the driver's door. But before he got in, he paused and looked back toward the depot. For a moment, his eyes met Kyle's through the window, and Kyle saw something in that gaze that made his stomach tighten. It was not anger or fear. It was calculation, as if the man was weighing options and making a decision. Then the man opened the van door and climbed inside. Kyle expected the van to drive away, but instead, the man sat there with the engine running. 1 minute passed, then 2. Kyle could see the man's silhouette through the windshield, unmoving. The van's brake lights glowed red in the rain. Kyle felt his pulse quicken. Something was wrong. He reached for his phone, thinking he should call someone, though he was not sure who or why. That was when he heard it. A thumping sound from inside the van. 3 distinct thuds against metal, rhythmic and deliberate. Then silence. Then 3 more thuds. Kyle stared at the van, his hand frozen on his phone. The man in the driver's seat did not move or react to the sounds. He just sat there, waiting. Kyle made a decision. He stepped out from behind the counter and walked to the door of the depot. He opened it and called out to the van, asking if everything was all right. The man rolled down his window and looked at Kyle with that same calculating expression. He said everything was fine, that he was just checking his map before heading out. His tone was calm and reasonable, but it did not match the tension in his jaw or the way his hands gripped the steering wheel. Kyle asked about the thumping sound, saying it sounded like something was loose in the back of the van. The man's expression hardened. He said Kyle must have heard the fuel pump shutting off, or maybe an animal on the roof of the depot. He thanked Kyle for his concern and said he would be on his way. But he still did not drive away. He just sat there, staring at Kyle, waiting to see what Kyle would do next. Kyle felt trapped between his instincts and his lack of concrete evidence. He could not call the police because someone was sitting in a van at a gas station. He could not demand to see inside the van because he had no authority to do so. But he also could not shake the certainty that something terrible was happening. He stood in the doorway, getting soaked by the rain, trying to decide, and that was when he heard the thumping again. 3 thuds. Pause. 3 thuds. It was definitely coming from inside the van, and it was definitely deliberate. Someone was in there, and they were trying to signal for help. Kyle pulled out his phone and dialed the Alaska State Trooper emergency line. The nearest trooper was 45 minutes away, but Kyle did not care. He kept his eyes on the van while he waited for someone to answer. The man in the driver's seat saw what Kyle was doing, and his expression changed from calculation to cold rage. He threw the van into reverse and backed away from the pumps, tires spinning on the wet pavement. Kyle shouted into his phone that a white van was fleeing the Harbor Point fuel depot and that he believed someone was being held in the back of it. He tried to read the license plate as the van sped away, but the rain and darkness made it impossible. He could only tell the dispatcher the make and color of the vehicle and the direction it was heading, north on the coastal road toward the town of Whittier. The trooper arrived an hour later. Kyle gave his statement, describing everything he had seen and heard. The trooper took notes and said he would put out an alert for the van. But he also told Kyle that without a license plate number or a clear description of a crime, there was little he could do. The thumping sounds could have been cargo shifting. The man's behavior could have been nervousness or annoyance at being questioned. Kyle understood the trooper's position, but he also knew what he had heard. Someone had been in that van asking for help. 3 days later, Kyle received a call from the Alaska State Troopers. They had found the white van abandoned on a logging road 15 miles north of Harbor Point. The back of the van had been recently cleaned with bleach, but luminol testing revealed massive amounts of blood that had soaked into the floor panels. DNA analysis would take weeks, but the troopers believed they were looking at a crime scene. They asked Kyle to come in and provide a more detailed statement, and to work with a sketch artist to create a composite of the man's face. Kyle did everything they asked. He described the man in as much detail as he could remember. Average height, average build, dark hair going gray at the temples, no distinguishing marks. The sketch artist created an image that looked like 1,000 other middle-aged men. The troopers thanked Kyle and told him they would be in touch if they had more questions. Weeks turned into months. The DNA from the van was matched to a woman named Sarah Chen, who had been reported missing from Anchorage 2 weeks before Kyle's encounter. Sarah was a 33-year-old accountant who had disappeared while walking to her car after work. Her body was never found. The investigation went nowhere. The man from the fuel depot vanished as completely as Sarah had. Without a name, a license plate, or any identifying information, the troopers had nothing to work with. Kyle quit his job at the fuel depot a month after giving his statement. He could not stand the thought of working there anymore, of sitting behind that counter knowing that he had been so close to saving Sarah Chen, and had hesitated just long enough for her killer to escape. He moved to Fairbanks and found work on a construction crew, trying to rebuild his life and move past the guilt. But Kyle still thinks about that night every single day. He thinks about the thumping sounds, 3 deliberate thuds that he now knows were Sarah using the last of her strength to call for help. He thinks about the moment he hesitated before calling the police, those precious seconds when he talked himself into doubting his instincts. He thinks about how different things might have been if he had acted faster or been braver or made just one different choice. And he thinks about the man in the van, who is still out there somewhere, still driving the back roads of Alaska with his empty eyes and his cargo of horror. Kyle wonders how many other people have seen that van pull into a gas station late at night. He wonders how many of them noticed something wrong and then convinced themselves they were imagining it. He wonders how many opportunities there have been to stop this man, and how many of those opportunities were lost because someone hesitated or doubted or simply did not want to get involved. Kyle knows he will carry this burden for the rest of his life. The weight of a woman he never met but failed to save nonetheless. Lily Chen worked at the front desk of the Timber Lodge, the only hotel in the small Alaskan town of Copper Ridge, a community of 400 people nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains and dense forest. She had held the job for 6 years, ever since she graduated from high school and decided to stay in the town where she had grown up, rather than move to Anchorage or Fairbanks, like most of her classmates. Lily was 24 years old, quiet and efficient, the kind of employee who showed up on time and never caused problems. She knew most of the people in Copper Ridge by name, and she was familiar with the rhythms of the town, the seasonal workers who came and went, the tourists who passed through during the summer months, and the occasional traveler who stopped for a night on their way to somewhere else. The job was not exciting, but it was steady and comfortable, and Lily liked the predictability of it. She had checked in hundreds of guests over the years, and she prided herself on being able to read people, to sense when someone was friendly or standoffish, honest or sketchy. But on the night of August 9th, 2023, Lily checked in a man who seemed so completely ordinary that she would never have guessed that he was one of the most dangerous people she would ever meet. The man arrived at the lodge around 8 in the evening, just as Lily was settling in for the quiet hours of her shift. He drove a silver sedan that looked like a rental, and he walked into the lobby carrying a small duffel bag and a laptop case. He appeared to be in his late 30s, clean-shaven, wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt that made him look like a middle manager on a business trip. He smiled politely at Lily and said he needed a room for 2 nights. His voice was pleasant and unremarkable, with no accent that Lily could detect. He seemed tired, but not unfriendly. There was absolutely nothing about him that set off any alarm bells. Lily asked for his identification and credit card, the standard procedure for check-in. The man handed over a driver's license from Washington State. The name on the license was Sean Whitmore, and the photo matched the man standing in front of her. Lily entered his information into the computer and swiped his credit card. The card was declined. The man frowned and apologized, saying that sometimes his bank flagged transactions in remote locations as potential fraud. He asked if he could try a different card. Lily said of course, and waited while he pulled out another credit card from his wallet. This one went through without a problem. Lily completed the check-in process and handed Sean the key to room 12, a standard single on the 2nd floor overlooking the parking lot. She told him that breakfast was served from 7 to 9 in the morning and that the lobby door locked at 11, though guests could use their room keys to access the building after hours. Sean thanked her, took his key, and headed up the stairs with his bags. Lily watched him go and then returned to the paperwork on her desk. She thought nothing more about the interaction. It had been completely routine, forgettable, the kind of check-in she processed a dozen times a week. The next morning, Lily arrived for her shift at 7 and relieved the night clerk. She set up the breakfast area and started the coffee. A few guests came down for food, including Sean Whitmore from room 12. He filled a plate with scrambled eggs and toast, poured a cup of coffee, and sat at one of the small tables by the window. Lily said good morning to him, and he returned the greeting with a friendly nod. He ate quickly, checked his phone a few times, and then went back upstairs. Again, there was nothing unusual about his behavior. He was just another business traveler eating a mediocre hotel breakfast before starting his day. Sean checked out the following morning, August 11th, exactly as scheduled. He returned his room key, declined a receipt, and told Lily he hoped to visit Copper Ridge again sometime. She wished him a safe trip and watched as he loaded his bags into his car and drove away, heading south toward the main highway. And that was the end of it, or so Lily thought. 4 days later, on August 15th, 2 Alaska State Troopers walked into the Timber Lodge and asked to speak with whoever had been working the front desk on the evening of August 9th. Lily was on duty and told them that she had been the one working that night. The troopers asked if she remembered checking in a man named Sean Whitmore. Lily pulled up the records on her computer and confirmed that yes, she had checked in a guest by that name who had stayed in room 12 for 2 nights. The troopers asked her to describe the man and tell them everything she remembered about the interaction. Lily described Sean as best she could: the khaki pants, the polo shirt, the polite demeanor, the declined credit card. She told the troopers that there had been nothing suspicious or unusual about him, that he had seemed like a completely normal guest. One of the troopers, a woman named Sergeant Paula Ramos, asked if the man had said anything about where he was going or what he was doing in Copper Ridge. Lily thought back and said that he had not mentioned anything specific, that their conversation had been limited to the standard check-in questions and pleasantries. Sergeant Ramos exchanged a look with the other trooper and then told Lily that the man who had checked in as Sean Whitmore was actually named Timothy Vance, and that he was wanted in connection with 3 murders in Washington and Oregon. The real Sean Whitmore had been found dead in a storage unit outside Seattle 2 months earlier. Timothy Vance had stolen his identity, along with the identities of at least 6 other men, and had been using them to move around the Pacific Northwest and Alaska while evading law enforcement. The troopers needed to search room 12 and collect any evidence Vance might have left behind. Lily felt her legs go weak, and she sat down heavily in her desk chair. She had stood 3 feet away from a serial killer, had handed him a room key, had smiled at him, and wished him a good stay. He had walked past her on the stairs, had eaten breakfast in the same room where she was setting up coffee and pastries, and she had noticed nothing. He had seemed so normal, so utterly unremarkable, that she would have forgotten him entirely if the troopers had not shown up asking questions. The troopers spent 2 hours processing room 12. They collected fingerprints, hair samples, and fibers from the bedding and carpet. They examined the bathroom and searched the trash. When they were finished, Sergeant Ramos came back downstairs and told Lily that they had found evidence suggesting Vance had been planning another crime while he was in Copper Ridge. There were maps of the area with certain roads and buildings marked, along with handwritten notes about the schedules and routines of local residents. The troopers believed Vance had been surveilling potential victims during his 2-day stay. Sergeant Ramos asked Lily if she had seen Vance talking to anyone else during his time at the lodge, or if she had noticed him paying particular attention to any other guests or staff members. Lily tried to remember, but she could only recall him being alone, eating breakfast by himself, keeping to himself. She asked the sergeant if they knew who Vance had been targeting, and Ramos hesitated before saying that they believed one of the marked locations on the map was Lily's home address. There was a note next to it that said, "Works morning shift and lives alone." The realization hit Lily like a physical blow. Timothy Vance had not just been a guest passing through Copper Ridge. He had been there hunting, and she had been one of his potential targets. If he had not checked out when he did, if he had stayed an extra day or decided to come back, Lily might have been his 4th victim. She asked the troopers why he had left, why he had not followed through with whatever he had been planning. Sergeant Ramos said they did not know for certain, but they believed Vance might have become spooked when his first credit card was declined. He might have worried that the transaction would be flagged and investigated, and he had decided to move on rather than risk being caught. The troopers told Lily that they were increasing patrols in Copper Ridge and that she should be vigilant about her personal security. They gave her a number to call if she saw anything suspicious or if Timothy Vance made any attempt to contact her. Then they left with the evidence they had collected, promising to keep her updated on the investigation. But there were no updates. Timothy Vance disappeared after leaving Copper Ridge, and despite a multi-state manhunt, he was never found. The FBI believes he is still alive and still killing, using stolen identities to stay hidden and mobile. His victims have all been young women who lived alone in small towns where people felt safe enough to trust a polite stranger with an ordinary face. Lily still works at the Timber Lodge, though she is asked to be moved to day shifts, so she's never alone in the building at night. She has installed security cameras at her home, and she carries pepper spray in her pocket wherever she goes. But the thing that haunts her most is not the fear of Timothy Vance returning. It is the knowledge that she looked evil in the face and saw nothing. She had every opportunity to sense something wrong, to feel the danger that was standing 3 feet away from her, and she had felt nothing. Because Timothy Vance had been so perfectly, convincingly ordinary. Lily thinks about this every time a new guest checks into the lodge. She studies their faces, listens to their voices, watches their body language, searching for some sign that might tell her who they really are. But she knows now that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it wears khaki pants and a polo shirt and declines a credit card and smiles politely and says thank you. And you would never know, never suspect, never see it until it was far too late. And that knowledge has changed everything about the way Lily sees the world and the people in it. She knows now that monsters are real and that they look exactly like everyone else.